My name is Margaret Hale. I was 62 years old that night, and the rain made sure I felt every one of those years. The storm had been following me for hours, pounding against my windshield so hard it blurred the road into a single, endless ribbon of gray. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel, but I didn't slow down. I had already driven 6 hours, and turning back felt harder than continuing. At my age, you learn to push through discomfort because people are counting on you to show up. On the passenger seat sat a small black lockbox. Inside were documents and gifts I had carefully prepared, worth just under $80,000. Not something impulsive, not something flashy, something meant to help my son's family feel secure, something meant to say that, even now, I was still here for them. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked warm and bright against the storm. The porch light was on. Laughter drifted faintly through the walls. For a brief moment, I felt that familiar flicker of hope, the quiet belief that maybe this visit would be different. I stepped under the awning to shake the rain from my coat before knocking. That was when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice. She wasn't angry. She wasn't whispering. She spoke calmly, almost casually, the way people do when they believe they're safe from being heard. She was talking about me as if I were a situation, a timeline, something that would eventually resolve itself. My son was there too. I waited for him to interrupt her, to correct her, to say my name with warmth or concern. He didn't. In that silence, something inside me shifted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't heartbreak. It was clarity. I walked back to my car without knocking. I sat there with the engine running, listening to the rain drum against the roof. I reached for the lockbox, hesitated, then placed it on the floor by my feet. I pulled out of the driveway and turned the car around. That was the night I stopped pretending I didn't understand what was happening. For a long time, I believed that being needed was the same thing as being loved. I didn't come to that conclusion all at once. It settled into me slowly, over years, until it felt natural enough that I stopped questioning it. After my husband died, the house changed. Not in any dramatic way. The walls stayed the same. The furniture didn't move, but the silence had weight. It followed me from room to room, sat beside me at dinner, waited for me at night. People checked in at first, friends, relatives, co-workers. Then, as life always does, it moved on. I filled the empty space with work. My company had been part of my life for decades, and returning to it full-time felt practical. Safe. Numbers made sense when emotions didn't. Deadlines didn't ask how lonely I felt. They just needed to be met. Daniel was already an adult by then. He had his own apartment, his own routines, his own future unfolding somewhere I wasn't always invited into. We spoke on the phone once or twice a week at first, then less, not because of conflict, just distance. I told myself this was how healthy families worked. Parents stepped back, children stepped forward. When Daniel married Lauren, I made an effort to stay involved without hovering. She was pleasant in that careful way some people have, always smiling, always attentive. She asked questions about my health, my work, my travel schedule. At the time, it felt thoughtful. It didn't occur to me that attention could be something other than care. The first time they asked for help, it was small, a short-term loan to cover a gap between jobs. I didn't hesitate. The relief in Daniel's voice made me feel useful again, and usefulness had become a substitute for closeness in my life. I told myself that this was what parents did. They helped when they could. After that, the requests came more often, never demanding, always framed as temporary. Rent 1 month, tuition assistance the next, repairs, insurance, unexpected expenses. Each time, there was a story, and each story made sense on its own. I wired the money, wrote the checks, adjusted my accounts. Each transaction felt like an investment in keeping my place in their lives. What I didn't notice, or refused to notice, was how our conversations had changed. Calls rarely came without a purpose. Visits were planned around needs. When I talked about my own life, my words seemed to land and disappear. No follow-up questions. No curiosity that lingered. The beach house became part of this pattern without me realizing it. I had leased it years earlier as a retreat, a place where I could breathe when the world felt loud. Daniel mentioned it would be good for the children. Fresh air? Stability? Family time? I agreed, even as my own visits grew fewer and further apart. When I did go, it no longer felt like mine. There were moments when something felt off. Lauren asking detailed questions about my retirement plans during dinner. Daniel mentioning company structure in passing, as if it were casual conversation. I laughed it off, blaming my own sensitivity. Aging does that to you, or so I told myself. It makes you suspicious. It makes you overthink. I ignored how often Lauren photographed documents on my desk when she thought I wasn't looking. I ignored how Daniel spoke about my work as if it were already behind me. I ignored the way their gratitude had become assumed rather than expressed. The truth was, I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped helping, afraid that silence would replace the phone calls completely, afraid that without money changing hands, I would fade into the background of their lives. So when Daniel called about his birthday gathering, I said yes immediately. When Lauren mentioned how much it would mean to them if I could come, despite the weather, I told myself it was worth the drive. I prepared the lockbox carefully, reviewing documents late into the night, imagining the look on their faces when they realized how much I trusted them. That drive through the storm wasn't just about distance. It was about loyalty, about proving, again, that I was still willing to show up, even when it cost me something. Standing under that awning, listening to my name spoken without warmth, I finally understood what all those years had been leading toward. The support I had offered so freely hadn't built closeness. It had built expectation. As I drove away, the rain blurring the road ahead, a quiet realization settled over me. The life I thought I was protecting no longer existed the way I believed it did. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I stopped trying to earn my place in my own family. I didn't sleep much after that night, not because I was replaying what I'd heard, but because my mind felt unusually clear. For years, my thoughts had been tangled with excuses and justifications. Now, there was a strange quiet where certainty lived. The next morning, I made coffee and let it go cold on the counter. I stood at the window longer than usual, watching the street wake up, noticing how ordinary everything looked. The world hadn't changed. Only my understanding of my place in it had. By mid-morning, I called Evan Brooks. Evan had been my attorney for years, long enough to know when my voice meant business rather than panic. I didn't dramatize what had happened. I didn't repeat the conversation word for word. I simply told him that I wanted to protect myself financially and emotionally, and I wanted to do it cleanly. He asked me if I was acting out of anger. I told him no. I was acting out of clarity. That seemed to satisfy him. We went through what that clarity would look like in practice, adjusting the trust, tightening access to accounts, clarifying company authority, ending informal arrangements that had never been meant to last this long. Everything was legal. Everything was reversible if I chose to reverse it later. But for the first time, the choice would be mine. When I hung up the phone, I didn't feel empowered in the dramatic way movies portray. I felt steady, grounded. as if I had finally placed my feet on solid ground after years of balancing on something unstable. I didn't call Daniel that day. I didn't feel the need to explain myself preemptively. For once, I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't rush to manage other people's reactions. The first call came that evening. Daniel's voice sounded cautious, as though he were approaching an animal he wasn't sure would bite. He asked if everything was okay. I noticed how quickly he moved past the question, as if the answer wasn't the point. When I told him that I was reorganizing my finances and that future matters would go through my attorney, the line went quiet. Then came confusion, then irritation, thinly veiled under concern. He asked why I was making things difficult. Why now? I told him I wasn't making things difficult. I was making them clear. Lauren's messages started shortly after. Long paragraphs that shifted tone from worry to disappointment, then to subtle accusation. She reminded me of everything they were juggling, everything they were dealing with. She asked if I understood the pressure they were under. I read the messages once and set my phone face down on the table. For the first time, I didn't feel compelled to respond. 2 days later, my bank notified me of an attempted login that had been blocked. It wasn't a dramatic breach, just a quiet alert, but it told me more than any argument could have. I forwarded the notice to Evan and said nothing else. By the end of the week, the informal support I had been providing had officially stopped. No announcements, no confrontations, just silence where money used to flow. That silence didn't last long. They showed up at my office the following Monday without an appointment. I was in a meeting when my assistant knocked gently and told me Daniel and Lauren were in the lobby. I watched them through the glass walls, their posture rigid, their expressions tight. Security stood nearby, polite but firm. When I finally stepped out to meet them, Daniel tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. Lauren crossed her arms, her gaze sharp with expectation. They wanted answers. They wanted reassurance. They wanted me to go back to the version of myself that filled gaps without asking questions. I didn't give them what they wanted. I told them, calmly, that any financial discussions would go through my attorney, that my decisions weren't open for debate in the lobby of my workplace, that this wasn't punishment. It was a boundary. Lauren accused me of being cold. Daniel said I was overreacting. I listened without interrupting, noticing how familiar the pattern felt. Their frustration wasn't about losing me. It was about losing access. When they left, the building felt quieter than usual. Not emptier, just calmer. That evening, sitting alone in my living room, I felt the weight of what I had done settle over me. This wasn't a dramatic break. It was a slow, deliberate step away from a role I had outgrown. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know what it would cost me emotionally. But I did know one thing with absolute certainty. I was done explaining myself to people who only listened when money was involved. And once that decision was made, there was no turning back. For a few weeks after that confrontation at my office, things went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Not peaceful, not hostile, just suspended, like everyone involved was waiting to see who would blink first. Daniel stopped calling. Lauren didn't send any more long messages. The absence of noise was almost louder than the arguments had been. I told myself this was what boundaries look like in real life, not dramatic declarations, just space where expectations used to be. I stayed focused on my work, meetings, reports, schedules. Familiar routines helped keep my emotions from drifting too far. Still, there were moments, late evenings, empty weekends when the silence pressed in. I missed the idea of my family more than the reality of it. That distinction mattered, even when it hurt. The next escalation came quietly, the way most serious things do. Evan called one afternoon to tell me that Daniel had contacted him directly, not to discuss logistics, but to ask questions, hypothetical ones, about what would happen if I became incapacitated, about decision-making authority, about timelines. Hearing that confirmed what I had already suspected. They weren't confused. They were recalculating. A few days later, I received a letter from their attorney. The tone was formal, almost apologetic, but the message underneath was clear. They believed I was acting irrationally. They suggested mediation. They implied that my recent decisions could be interpreted as punitive. I read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. For years, I had been afraid of conflict. Now, I recognized this for what it was. Not conflict, but pressure. I agreed to meet Daniel, not at my home, not at my office. We chose a neutral place, a small cafe near the river where conversations stayed quiet and public. I arrived early and sat by the window, watching the water move steadily past, unaffected by any of us. Daniel walked in alone. He looked tired, older than I remembered, or maybe I was seeing him clearly for the first time in a long while. He sat across from me, wrapped his hands around his coffee, and avoided my eyes. We talked about ordinary things at first, the weather, work, safe topics. Then he asked the question he had come to ask. Why was I doing this? I didn't answer right away. I wanted to choose my words carefully, not to protect him, but to stay honest with myself. I told him about the night of the storm, about standing outside the door, about what I heard. His reaction wasn't outrage or denial. It was silence. That silence told me everything I needed to know. When he finally spoke, he didn't argue the facts. He didn't claim I had misunderstood. Instead, he said I was taking things too personally, that Lauren hadn't meant it the way it sounded, that families talked about contingencies all the time. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw how practiced his reasoning was, how comfortable he had become justifying behavior that benefited him. I told him I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed in the way he expected. I was finished pretending that love and entitlement were the same thing. He asked if this meant I was cutting him out of my life entirely. I told him no, but it did mean that our relationship would have to exist without financial dependency. If that wasn't something he could accept, then the distance between us would be his choice, not mine. We sat there for a long moment after that. The cafe hummed quietly around us. Cups clinked. Someone laughed at a nearby table. Life went on. When Daniel stood to leave, he hesitated, as if he wanted to say something else. He didn't. He nodded once and walked out. That was the last time we spoke in person for a long while. The practical consequences followed quickly after that. The lease on the beach house wasn't renewed under their name. Utilities were transferred. Access to shared accounts remained restricted. None of it was sudden. None of it was cruel. It was simply final. Lauren sent one last message a week later. Short. Controlled. She said she hoped I was happy with my choices. I read it without responding. Happiness wasn't the word I would have used. What I felt was quieter than that. Heavier. More honest. One evening, as I locked up my office and walked through the empty parking lot, I realized something that stopped me mid-step. For the first time in years. I wasn't bracing myself for the next request. I wasn't anticipating the next emergency. The tension I had lived with for so long was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar. Freedom. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. I only knew that whatever came next would be built on truth, not obligation. And that realization, more than any argument or letter, marked the true end of the life I had been quietly enduring and the beginning of something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine before. In the months that followed, life didn't transform overnight. There was no sudden sense of joy, no dramatic relief that washed everything clean. What came instead was something quieter, slower, and far more honest. My days became simpler, not empty, just uncluttered. I no longer checked my phone with a tight feeling in my chest, wondering who might need something from me next. Mornings started without urgency. Evenings ended without that familiar knot of worry. For the first time in years, my time belonged to me. Daniel didn't call. Lauren didn't reach out again. I didn't chase silence. And I didn't fill it with explanations. The space between us stayed exactly where it was. And over time, I learned to accept that not all distance is something you're meant to close. There were moments, of course, when grief resurfaced. Holidays were the hardest. I would catch myself setting the table for more people than would arrive, then stop and quietly put the extra plates away. Loss doesn't disappear just because you make a healthy decision. It lingers. It asks to be acknowledged. What surprised me was how different that grief felt now. It wasn't tangled with resentment or confusion. I wasn't asking myself what I had done wrong. I wasn't replaying conversations in my head, wondering how I could have handled things better. I had already answered those questions. I had done what I needed to do. The practical changes unfolded naturally. I sold the beach house, not out of spite, but because it no longer represented rest. It carried too many reminders of compromise. Letting it go felt like closing a chapter I had outgrown. I simplified my estate plans further, making decisions that reflected my values rather than my fears. Some of what I set aside went to organizations that supported older women facing financial exploitation. I didn't make announcements about it. I didn't need recognition. It felt right to turn something painful into something protective for someone else. At home, I made small changes. I moved furniture, cleared out rooms I had avoided since my husband passed. One afternoon, almost on impulse, I visited a shelter and came home with an older dog whose gray muzzle reminded me a little too much of myself. He didn't need saving. He just needed a place to rest. We understood each other immediately. Work changed too, not in title or responsibility, but in how it felt. I delegated more. I took afternoons off without guilt. I stopped proving myself to anyone who hadn't asked for proof. The company ran just fine without my constant oversight, and that realization was both humbling and freeing. Every so often, I would hear updates through mutual acquaintances. Daniel and Lauren struggled. The loss of financial support exposed cracks they hadn't known how to fill. Eventually, they separated. When I heard that, I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt a quiet sadness for the life they had tried to build on something unstable. There was one letter that arrived months later. Daniel's handwriting on the envelope stopped me for a moment before I opened it. Inside, his words were careful, restrained. He apologized, not for what he had said that night, but for not defending me, for assuming I would always be there, always willing to absorb whatever was needed. I read the letter slowly, then folded it and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't write back right away. Forgiveness, I had learned, didn't require immediate action. It required honesty. What I understood now, more clearly than ever, was that love without respect is not love at all. It's dependency, and dependency, left unchecked, corrodes even the strongest bonds. I didn't close the door on my son. I simply removed the lock that allowed him to take without asking. If one day we speak again, it will be as two adults choosing connection, not as one person funding the illusion of it. On quiet evenings, I sit on my porch and listen to the world settle around me. Cars pass, neighbors talk, my dog sleeps at my feet. There's no storm pressing against the windows now, no long drive ahead of me, no locked box waiting on the seat beside me. What remains is a life that finally feels balanced. If there is one thing I would say to anyone listening to my story, it's this: loneliness can make us generous in ways that hurt us. Love can blind us to patterns we would recognize instantly in someone else's life. But clarity, once it arrives, is a gift you don't owe anyone an explanation for keeping. I didn't lose my family that night in the storm. I lost the version of myself who believed love had to be earned. And in its place, I found something steadier, something quieter, and something that, at last, felt like peace.